Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our very first event of 2022. For those who don't know me, my name is Caroline Stevenson, and I am partner and head of the Financial Services Regulatory team here at Burness Paul, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. On behalf of my team, myself, and the firm, I'd like to really wish you a very happy new year. We hope you had a great break over the festive period, and we're wishing you lots of health and lots of adventures in 2022. So we're just going to get straight into it today because, as you can imagine, we have got a lot to cover in this hour. So just quickly, just the usual housekeeping. As usual, our sessions will be recorded and these will be distributed after the event today. So please just keep your cameras off and keep yourself on mute. We do have space for, well, we've scheduled some space for questions at the end. So feel free to add your questions in as we go, just so you don't forget them, and we'll compile them and hopefully be able to get to them at the end of our topics. So firstly, I am delighted to be able to introduce our speakers today. You get a treat today. You not one, not two, not three, but four speakers today. So myself will be speaking. Chris Woodvine, who is the newest member of my team, he will also do some topics. And we've got our usuals, Natasha and Lorna. They will introduce themselves briefly just before they start their talk for the first time. So without further ado, I'm just going to go straight into it. As I say, we've got lots to pack in today. So I'm sure you're all aware with the FCA business plan, but I think given the regulatory initiatives we're expecting this year are implemented largely through the items we're going to discuss today, then it makes sense to remind ourselves about where it's at. I have to admit, and I keep saying this, but I was a bit disappointed with the business plan this year for a couple of reasons. I felt that it kind of was a bit of a huge fanfare, a big applause for everything that the FCA had achieved, but it didn't really mention some of the areas where they've been struggling a bit, such as delays and resourcing. So I found that a bit disappointed. But however, despite that, this year the FCA have confirmed that they will, and they're going to plan to deliver for consumers by taking forward the 4 priorities they identified in last year's plan, so effectively recycling the year prior's work, and also by introducing the new consumer duty. And so just as a reminder, the 4 priorities that they identified are enabling effective consumer investment decisions, ensuring the consumer credit markets work well, making payments safe and accessible, and delivering fair value in a digital age. And you'll see as we go through the presentation today that work on this has already begun, because you'll see that some of these are the topics that we're going to be discussed because we're already aware of the initiatives and what they're starting to look like. So the second thing the FCA business plan said they wanted to achieve this year is to enhance market integrity by reinforcing the effectiveness of wholesale markets and enhancing their supervisory approach to specific issues. Again, you'll see this coming up and time again. And finally, they've got a whole suite of cross-sectoral issues that they want to make sure that they get right. You can see those on the screen. So the usual fraud, financial resilience, op resilience, which you should all be aware of because that's due to be implemented very soon. And also things like diversity and inclusion and sustainability is all peppered throughout lots of the different topics and areas. And throughout all of these topics and these 3 bullets, you'll see that there's key trends. It's all about consumer outcomes, it's about diversity, inclusion, and it's about sustainability. So from our presentations today, you'll see that the FCA has already kick-started some of the plans to implement some of the business plan outcomes and objectives. And so how we're going to do today is we're going to look at each quarter of the year. We're going to give you a reminder of some of the key dates that fall within that quarter. And then we're going to do a deep dive into 1 or 2 areas that's popping up in that quarter, just to provide a bit more detail for you of what's happening. And don't worry about frantically noting down the dates on the timeline. We have got a little gift for you when we send out the recording. We'll also be sending out a handy sort of horizon scan in Ed Memoir, which you can have on your desktop that you can open up as you like. But just to say, we obviously have only got an hour. There's a lot to get through. So our horizon scanning isn't exhaustive, like the document isn't exhaustive. We don't have the time and the time in the hour nor the space in the slides to to cover everything. So with that caveat, I'm just going to say you should definitely make sure that you still keep on top of your own horizon scanning log. Don't rely on ours, because it may not have everything in there that's relevant to your own business. So against that backdrop, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker. As I said at the outset, he is the newest member of my team, and that's Chris Woodfine, and he will give some handy tips on what horizon scanning process should look like, and it's particularly going to focus on this as the UK diverges from the EU rules. Over to Chris. Chris, we can't hear you. Sorry, 1 second. There's always got to be a little bit of technical hitches at the start of any presentation. So let's give Chris 1 second. So just by way of, we can't hear you, Chris. No. So by way of background, Chris just joined my team at the start of the year, and he has, I feel like I'm stealing his thunder a bit, but he has joined from Bank of New York Mellon Pershing, where he had a very strategic role in terms of horizon scanning and making sure that the business was run compliantly, and that the kind of regulatory change programs were put in place. So he's got some really valuable insight and hints and tips on how a good horizon scanning program is run internally in-house. And he also is going to focus on what's going to happen as the UK starts to moving away from the EU rules, which I think, let's just bear with me 1 second to see if he's come back in. I tell you what, why don't we will pop the practicalities of horizon scanning in the EU. Oh, here's back. Just if you come off mute and we'll check if we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Perfect. That's it. On you go, Chris. Apologies for that, everyone. Over to Chris.
Apologies, everyone. It's got to happen on the first day, hey? Okay, so I'm not sure how far Caroline got, but my main focus of today's presentation is really to talk about the government's UK Financial Services Framework consultation, and to talk to the potential for UK divergence in its rulemaking from the EU. However, before that, I just thought it was worth a couple of minutes to touch on the practicalities of horizon scanning, just to remind ourselves of why you're potentially dialing into this presentation and why firms such as Burness Paul host them. So as Caroline said, for the last 3 years prior to joining Burness Paul, my role was to undertake horizon scanning and provide strategic regulatory advice to BNY Mellon Pershing in EMEA. As many of you will know, for any regulated business, and particularly those with multiple product or service offerings, or those operating across borders, it's vital for the executive team, those responsible for legal and compliance, and indeed those teams who will ultimately implement or be subject to a change, to be aware of upcoming regulatory change. This allows appropriate planning to be undertaken, resources allocated, and allows for appropriate prioritization that ultimately can save firms from regulatory breach and any penalties that may follow. The key to effective horizon scanning is to ensure that as a firm you have the right tools and processes to ensure you're able to capture all of the regulatory change applying to your firm. For many firms, this will involve a third-party subscription to a service provider that will scrape and filter regulatory updates and publications from specified websites, or for smaller firms, this may simply be a manual daily, weekly review of a regulator's website, along with attendance at events such as this to understand what's coming up in the next year. Another challenge is to ensure that a full gap analysis is undertaken on a particular item to ensure firms understand the exact nature of the change and any actions that may need to follow. And this is a stage where firms may need assistance from outside counsel or regulatory consultants such as us with the interpretation of the change requirements. Or perhaps if the changes are at a proposal stage, firms need assistance with responding to a consultation or engaging with its regulator if the change is detrimental to the firm. And finally, those tasked with implementing regulatory change at firms will know they need to be blessed with patience and expectation management, as the high-level requirements issued often require further clarification, which can delay projects until secondary legislation or regulatory guidance has been issued, often close to a regulatory implementation deadline. So, as Caroline says, I'm going to try and give some tips for when undertaking horizon scanning. My first tip for firms is that before they appoint third-party resources, they should consider how often the exec or key stakeholders want to be updated on regulatory change. Is it daily, weekly, even monthly? This will help determine the level of support needed from third-party providers. Secondly, in my view, it's important for firms to receive advice if needed at an early stage in the change process to ensure any implementation project is started on the right terms. And then my final tip is for those particularly difficult regulatory change that can require technology updates and then often involve large budgets. I think it's important for those charged with looking at the legislation to not be afraid to make it clear that often the exact scope of the change is uncertain and it may be some time before there is clarity. This can often be a difficult conversation with those tasked with updating the technology, but it will avoid a range of problems and help with budgeting and resource allocation. So, to the main focus of my presentation today is the theme of EU divergence. And I'm going to take a look at the UK proposals around the regulatory framework going forward. This, in fact, does link in some ways to the practicalities of horizon scanning. I can see that many of the firms on this call operate in areas where the regulation has originated from the EU. For me personally, when relevant, I've always looked to the EU directive or regulation first and then worked to understand if a member state, such as the UK, are gold plating the requirements or using discretions given in the EU text. Post-Brexit, that approach to horizon scanning and gap analysis may need to change, and firms should be more conscious of ensuring a focus of the UK legislative process, as this is where UK regulatory change will originate from going forward. One of the themes most regulated firms should be alerted to this year, and indeed over the next few years, is regulatory divergence between the EU and the UK in relation to financial services regulation. A large proportion of the current legislation that applies to regulated firms has originated from the EU directives and regulations and was retained in UK law through the EU Withdrawal Act and various secondary legislation as part of the Brexit process. It's therefore fair to say that once you take account of the loss of EU passporting rights for UK firms to access EU markets and the technical changes made to retain EU law and make it work in the UK, in fact, the current UK rulebook is broadly the status quo. But this won't necessarily be the case going forward. The EU is not in favour of a wholesale equivalence regime for the UK, and the UK abandoned its approach in March last year. So you may ask, what will the UK regulatory framework look like in the near and medium term? This is currently under review by the UK government, who issued a consultation in October 2020 and a further consultation just in November last year, providing responses to the first consultation. The second consultation closes responses on the 9th of February 2022. So there is some limited time for firms who wish to engage and respond to the consultation to do so. And to the extent you require any assistance with this, then we are happy to help. For those firms that haven't engaged or just want a brief overview of the key takeaways, then these are as follows. The UK government is seeking to build on the strengths of the UK's existing model of regulation, namely the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, known as FSMA, This model delegates the setting of regulatory standards to expert, operationally independent regulators such as the FCA and PRA, whilst retaining the oversight of Parliament. This approach was overwhelmingly supported by stakeholders responding to the first consultation. As part of the proposals, the regulators would have an enhanced role and take on a significant new regulatory policy making responsibility. The idea here is the UK wants to have a dynamic regulatory system that allows expert regulators the ability to act nimbly when regulating the sector. However, there's basically a technical problem with this approach relating to EU law that was retained as part of the Brexit process. The directly applicable EU law was transferred to UK primary and secondary legislation rather than the regulator's rulebook, which means that these EU rules are difficult and time-consuming to update, as any amendment has to go through the relevant parliamentary process and doesn't fit in with the UK government's view in having a dynamic regulator. So the government's proposed solution to this is to move much of this retained EU law to the regulator's rulebook, so the FCA handbook, etc. In order to do this, the government needs to expand the powers of the regulators to cover all areas of financial services regulation currently retained in EU law. The government anticipates the process of moving the law into the regulator's rulebook will take several years, and each rule change will be subject to a parliamentary review. If the proposals go ahead, and this is the point that I really want firms to take away, then they should be conscious that any existing rules changes from the process may result in a divergence from EU rules. And this will pose a challenge for all UK firms to stay abreast of these changes as we go through the process. But clearly for those firms, either with an EU operation or customer base, this will be more complex and result in potential divergence in their businesses between the UK and EU rules. Just a footnote before I hand over back to Caroline, just to note that the FRF review does not cover any anti-money laundering rules, payment market participants that are regulated domestically, or any changes to the existing complaints and compensation processes. So over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. So as promised, we're going to now take you through each of the quarters, and so you can see some of the things you should be focusing on in that time. You can see this is some of the key regulatory initiatives that's due to land in Q1 2022, and you can see that we're definitely off to a big bang with some big hitters in there. You should be quite familiar with a lot of these because it's deadlines for projects that should have already be traveling through your change pad, such as operational resilience that I mentioned. But if you look at this, you'll see that you'll be able to spot some of the other key trends from the FCA business plan is suddenly starting to appear within this quarter. Things like diversity and ESG. But one of the big topics that we want to focus on in this quarter is the change to the appointed representatives regime. So I'm going to pass over to Lorna to take you through the changes.
Thanks, Caroline. So some of you on this call may know who I am, but for those of you who don't, I am Lorna Stephen and I'm a senior solicitor in the Financial Services Regulatory team. As Caroline said, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the proposed changes the FCA is looking at in relation to appointed representatives. For anyone who deals with appointed reps on a day-to-day basis, you'll be well aware that this has been a key area of concern for the FCA for some time. The FCA highlighted it as an area of particular focus in its latest business plan, stating that they were concerned about the lack of oversight exercised by principals in respect of their appointed reps. We've already seen the introduction of the appointed rep fee payable by principals per appointed representative, which was introduced last year, which the FCA said would go towards addressing some of the harms posed by improperly supervised appointed representatives. It's also likely on a practical level that this would act as a kind of deterrent so that firms don't keep historic appointed representatives on their books when they're no longer working with them. But the FCA is now taking things further and they launched a consultation paper in December 2021, which is due to close for responses in March, which proposes a number of key reforms, the aim of which is to broadly, one, give the FCA more information on the appointed representatives in the system, and two, to clarify the responsibilities of principals. The Treasury has also published a call for evidence in collaboration with the FCA to gather information on how market participants use the appointed representatives regime in order to assess whether legislative change is needed, in addition to the regulatory changes set out in the consultation paper. Given the time constraints today, I'll focus on the FCA's proposed changes in the consultation paper in this presentation, but the call for evidence published by the Treasury seeks views on the overall scope of the regime, whether the FCA has sufficient powers to prevent abuse of the regime, whether more direct regulatory requirements should be placed on the appointed representatives themselves, and the role of the Financial Ombudsman Service amongst all this. The FCA will take into account the responses to these points when publishing its final policy statement and any related rules. So now I'll give you an overview of the key proposals in the FCA's consultation paper and things to keep an eye on in the future. So the consultation builds on the findings of the thematic reviews of the general insurance sector in 2016 and the investment management sector in 2019, in which the FCA found shortcomings in principals' understandings of regulatory responsibilities for their appointed representatives. The FCA is clear that they consider the appointed representative regime an important aspect of the UK framework that brings the benefits of encouraging competition and providing greater market access to participants, but they also want to take action to mitigate the risk of harms. So how are they going to do that? There's kind of two main aspects to the proposal set out in the consultation paper. And the first one, arguably the meatier of the two, is the additional information requirements. So under the current rules, a principal only needs to provide high-level information on the market in which the appointed representative operates. The proposals set out in the consultation paper go much further, and whilst I won't go into them all here, I've picked out a few key pieces of information the FCA proposed to gather on the slide. These include the primary reason for the appointment, so principals will now need to justify why they're taking on an appointed representative. Details of the non-regulated business of the appointed representative, so the FCA can consider how large a part the non-regulated business plays in the wider scheme of the appointed representative's corporate activities. Details of the appointed rep's corporate group, and in order to consider any potential harms caused by the corporate structure or governance model, and the nature of the financial arrangement between the principal and the appointed representative, so whether that's by commission, flat fees, or additional payments. Presumably this is to allow the FCA to gather information on how appointed reps earn their fees and whether this could contribute to any of the harms which the FCA has been seeing. So if your business engages or is thinking about engaging any appointed representatives in the future, you'll need to keep a close eye on the finalised information requirements. For any new appointed representatives, the FCA is proposing that this information is submitted 60 calendar days before the appointed representative's appointment. However, for any principals with existing appointed representatives, they will need to report this information within 60 calendar days of the rule coming into force. It will definitely be a date for the diary once we know what the timescales are for implementing these new rules. And it's not just the case that these requirements will only apply to full appointed representatives. Whilst the FCA acknowledges that introducer appointed representatives generally represent less harm and therefore shouldn't be subject to exactly the same information requirements, they're still proposing that principals report further information, such as the nature of regulated activities undertaken and the financial arrangements, as is the case with kind of full appointed representatives. The FCA has also proposed that information about the nature of regulated activities the appointed rep carries out is included in the register. The aim is to stop consumers being misled by seeing a principal which has several permissions, whilst the appointed rep is only authorised to act in respect of a single permission. Whilst this seems like it should be helpful and will give consumers more information about the appointed representatives with whom they're engaging, it's possible that this will simply add more information to an already complex entry on the website. However, I do think it will be helpful to those of us who are working with appointed representatives in the financial services sector. So that's a quick canter through the additional information requirements. But the second part of the FCA's main proposals is to clarify the responsibilities of the principals and the FCA's expectations. Whilst the FCA has said that they're not looking to change the contents of the rules, and they're simply looking to clarify the existing responsibilities and expectations, it's clear from the proposals on the additional information that they are expecting principals to be much more hands-on with their appointed representatives. The consultation paper sets out some proposed changes to the existing wording of the glossary and SUP, and I won't go through all of that here, you'll be glad to know. But one of the key aspects I want to draw out from the paper was the proposed self-assessment document. This will be a document that principals will keep to record how the appointed representative senior management meet the fit and proper test every year, the appointed representative's financial position, the monitoring process, the principal's own controls and resources and risk assessment of how the appointed representative may pose consumer or market harm. Recognising the increased administrative burden involved in all this, the FCA isn't proposing that this document is submitted to them every year, but that it should be made available to the FCA on request. However, the document should be reviewed and refreshed on an annual basis to ensure that the principal is considering the risks that an appointed representative poses now and how the appointed representative senior management are meeting the fit and proper test this year. This also applies equally to introducer appointed representatives and full appointed representatives. So this document sounds like it will be good practice for principals. However, given that it is to be made available on request rather than being an annual submission, it will be important that principals engage with the process and ensure that it's refreshed every year. It's not simply a one and done process. So those are the two main areas the FCA is consulting on with proposals. However, the consultation paper also sets out some potential areas for further change. And these are very much for discussion on which the FCA is seeking industry views. These include the benefits, drawbacks of the regulatory hosting model, where the principal doesn't carry on regulated activities itself, but oversees the use of its permissions by appointed representatives. The issues that can arise where the appointed representative is larger than its principal or may become larger during the course of the engagement, and potential ways to address these, including banning the use of regulatory hosting services altogether. These are very much points for discussion at the moment, with no firm proposals having been drawn up yet, but it's clear that even after a policy statement in relation to the additional information and clarification of responsibilities is published, there may well still be regulatory changes afoot for the appointed representative regime in 2022 and beyond. So those are the changes that we're expecting to see for appointed representatives. I'll now hand you back to Caroline to talk about the changes we're expecting to see in Q2 2022.
Thanks, Lorna. So for the audience, you'll be pleased to know that's Q1 done, on to Q2. So you'll be able to see from the screen that at this stage, Q2 doesn't look to be as populated as Q1, and that's to be expected. And we're sure that this will become more populated as the FCA gets to work this year. But despite the lack of headings here, there are some big topics within this quarter. So we're going to tackle 3 of them, albeit briefly, in this segment. And it would be remiss of us not to tackle ESG at least once in this presentation. So let's start here. So as everybody on this call will know, ESG is a huge topic at the moment, and not least because of COP26 and the Glasgow Climate Pact. And if you've never explored it, I would highly recommend that you take a look at Burness Paul's ESG Hub, which is available on our website, and it's a source of valuable information on all things ESG. You'll see from the slide here that I've noted that the UK is required to reach net zero by 2050, and that's a legal requirement. It's legally required to do this. And so alongside this, the UK government is also pushing for the UK to be spearheading the global drive towards green and sustainable investment. We want to be seen as best in breed. And as a result of this, there is a huge amount of initiatives on the go and in the pipeline, and much of this will really directly affect you and your businesses. And there are ESG, as I said before, ESG is kind of peppered throughout each of the quarters because there's so much going on. But one of the biggest challenges I find with ESG is kind of data and reporting and the consistency around that. One's person apples and others pears, so it's really difficult to compare like for like when it comes to sustainable products. And that's not just for the users, the end users, the people engaging with the products, it's for the entities who are providing them to. So to tackle that this year, the UK is working on creating a green taxonomy. And taxonomy is effectively a common language or a type of dictionary. And that's going to be used to specify the criteria that economic activities must meet to be deemed to align with the taxonomy and therefore be considered to be sustainable. So the thinking is that the common language, or this sort of new categorization, will help improve clarity and consistency across financial services. And at this stage, however, I think that's got a bit of it's only part of the puzzle, because end financial services companies who are operating on the global or European stage might suddenly have to comply or try and understand or report on multi-jurisdictional taxonomies, and so it's going to be quite difficult, I think, to try and to implement this. So it'll be interesting to see where we go with this. But in terms of Q2 this year, and within the UK alone, we're starting to get to the crux of some of the developments, and we're expecting the FCA to consult on rules to implement the new sustainability disclosure requirements. If you've not heard this before, this will require firms to report against the UK's green taxonomy. The SCR, it's basically aiming to create a common framework for disclosing against that sustainability matrix, and that will likely apply to corporates and providers of certain financial products or services, such as asset managers, life insurers, and pension scheme providers, and in relation to the investment products themselves more generally. So it'll be interesting to see the detail of this one and the requirements imposed by the SDR once the consultation is launched. And we'll definitely be doing a standalone session on this, so do watch this space. In Q2, there's also a few updates in the financial crime world, and these all relate to the very snappy Untitled Mlrs 2017, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but just to give it its formal name, the Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing and Transfer of Funds Information on the Payer Regulations 2017. I'm just going to refer to them as the MLRs for the purposes of the changes today. So as you should be aware, the MLRs apply to a huge range of businesses which are identified as the most vulnerable to the risk of being used for money laundering or terrorist financing purposes. So there's a few changes and a few points to note in relation to the MLRs in Q2 this year. Firstly, HM Treasury has published a consultation paper on potential amendments to the MLRs, and it plans to take this forward through secondary legislation, which is due to be published in spring this year. And these changes are required to ensure that the UK regime continues to meet the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, standards, and to ensure consistency following Brexit. So the changes in the secondary legislation should include changes in scope to reflect the latest risk assessments, and this is probably going to be a narrowing of the remit of MLRs, and it might exclude or exempt some of the payment services providers who are deemed less or low risky. They might be excluded from MLRs. It might include changes to strengthen supervision, such as giving AML or counter-terrorist supervisors stronger access rights, for example. It also might expand the requirements to strengthen regime information sharing and gathering improvements, and it might implement some of the FATF guidelines on the transfer of crypto assets. So that's a watch this space, but we should see the legislation being laid in spring 2022, so just keep an eye for that, an eye out for that. The second topic related to financial crime that we should see in Q2 is a review which is due of the money laundering of the MLRs themselves. So under a regulation 108(1) of the MLRs, HM Treasury is required to carry out regular reviews of the MLRs, and the first report of this nature is due, as you can see from the screen, on the 26th of June, and it will be every 5 years thereafter. And the review will consider the effectiveness and scope of the regulations, and the proportionality of the duties and the powers it contains, the effectiveness of the enforcement actions that's been taken under the MLRs to date, and also it will look at how the MLRs are continuing to interact with other pieces of legislation. This review will also provide an opportunity to ensure that the UK anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism regimes respond to the UK's particular circumstances and risks now that the UK has withdrawn from the EU. So it will be interesting to see if the review results in any large-scale changes. But throughout this year, we should see this, and we'll kind of understand a bit more later in the year. Although we should get the detail of the review by end of June. There will be quite a few other financial crime areas that we should see more detail on throughout the year, particularly in relation to crypto assets. So it's watch this space if you're involved in that sector. I'm going to pass on to Chris now for one more small area where we're expecting to see some progress in Q2.
Thanks, Caroline. So for those of you on this call in the fund management space, and indeed those firms that allocate investor capital to funds, you should be aware that the FCA proposes to consult in H1 2022 on whether to enable a broader range of consumers to invest in LTAFs in a controlled way. So by way of background, the FCA finalised rules for an innovative new category of open-ended authorised funds, the Long-Term Asset Fund, or LTAF, in October 2021 with Policy Statement 2114. The LTAF has emerged from the FCA seeking to create an environment for investment in long-term, less liquid assets by investors who understand the risks and do not need immediate liquidity and have long-term investment horizons. In particular, the LTAF regime is to encourage UK pension funds to direct more of their £500 billion of capital towards the UK's economic recovery and to enable investors, particularly defined contribution pension schemes, to more confidently invest in liquid assets such as venture capital and infrastructure than they can using existing fund structures. So really this update is to say that there's now a consultation expected in H1 2022 to expand the those that can the range of consumers that can invest in these type of funds. So let's watch this space.
Thanks, Chris. So on to Q3 and what should we expect in this quarter? Well, as you can see, the further we get through the year, the less populated we are with sort of key developments that we're aware of. But again, that should continue to be populated throughout the year as the FCA launches more consultations or takes more actions. However, Q3, whilst it doesn't have too many entries here, it does have one of the biggest entries, which are one of the most feared changes in the industry this year, which is the consumer duty. We should also start to see some future payments traction, but in this year too, which we're going to cover briefly. But I'm going to pass on to Natasha now to discuss the consumer duty.
Thanks, Caroline. So hi, everyone. I am Natasha Brownlee, and as Caroline said earlier, I'm a managing associate on her team. And I'm going to touch briefly on kind of one of the key changes which has been brought in this year, which is, of course, the consumer duty. The proposed rules are expected to be published in Q3, so that's kind of why we're fitting it in to this part of the session, but it is very much an ongoing process. The consumer duty is going to directly informs and kind of supports the 4 consumer priorities in the business plan, which Caroline touched upon, and it has been on the horizon since May last year when the FCA published their initial consultation. So in terms of key dates for this year, the second consultation is still in play, and that closes on the 15th of February this year. So there's still time to respond for those of you that haven't yet. And the final rules are expected to be published on the 31st of July this year. Once those rules are published, it's likely that firms are going to have until the 30th of April next year to fully implement those rules. So not a huge amount of time given kind of the shake-up that it's bringing. And the FCA have said, as they have done in the past with kind of big changes, that they're going to be monitoring firms during this transitional period, and they're going to expect firms to be able to demonstrate progress within kind of the July to April period if asked. So something to bear in mind. So given it's a shake-up of how firms kind of treat customers and are going to require a number of kind of changes to be implemented. I'm sure most of you are kind of on it and have looked at the initial consultation already, and you might have already had kind of projects kicking off on a kind of guessing basis. But in any way, I thought it'd be helpful to kind of set out a reminder of what the consumer duty actually is and what's going to be or likely to be expected of you going forward. So in short, the duty is would basically increase the expectations on firms in respect of their engagement with retail customers, and in the FCA's view, provide a stronger protection for consumers in financial markets generally. The intention behind the consumer duty is to create an environment where firms compete in the interest of customers. And following feedback, the FCA has decided that the duty will be based on outcomes rather than sort of best interests. And this means that firms are going to be required to act to deliver good outcomes for all retail clients. However, the FCA have emphasised that it doesn't expect firms to be able to prevent all poor outcomes, so or to protect customers from risks that they understand and accept in certain markets. So just to kind of bear that in mind. As I kind of mentioned already, the consumer duty applies to retail clients. So what does that mean? The FCA have recognised that applying a single standard definition of retail customer kind of doesn't work, and it will create challenges in kind of different sectors. And kind of taking that on board, they're proposing to align the scope of the consumer duty with the existing scope and kind of the different sectors of the handbook. So for example, for consumer credit, the consumer duty is going to apply to regulated credit activities. For investments, it will apply to the kind of definition of retail clients in COBS. And for payment services, it will be in line with the PSRs. So it will apply to sort of business conducted with consumers, micro enterprises, and charities. So let's have a quick look now at how it's going to work in practice. The FCA are proposing there'll be three key elements. Firstly, there's going to be kind of the overarching principle, which will reflect overall standards of how you are, as a firm, expected to act. Two options were proposed in the initial consultation. Option one was for a firm to act to deliver good outcomes, and option two was a firm must act in the best interests of retail clients. And the majority of the respondents were supportive of option one, which the FCA have accepted. The duty itself will impose a higher standard than existing principles 6 and 7, which I'm sure you all know is treating customers fairly and in relation to client communications. Any firm that has the ability through its regulated activities to sort of influence the outcome experienced by retail clients will be caught, and it will apply across your supply chain. Given the kind of overlap between the new sort of higher standard and Principles 6 and 7, the FCA proposed that they're going to disapply 6 and 7 where the consumer duty applies. So that means 6 and 7 will continue to apply to conduct outside the scope of the consumer duty, for example, certain SMEs and wholesale businesses. The second part of the shake-up is that there will be cross-cutting rules which kind of fall underneath the principle, which will require three key behaviours from you. That's to act in good faith towards your retail customers, avoid foreseeable harm to retail customers, which kind of is originally in the consultation they sought to kind of say that you would avoid causing foreseeable harm, but that's been kind of brought down now to it's just avoid foreseeable harm. And enabling and support retail customers to pursue their financial objectives. The FCA isn't proposing to have additional cross-cutting rules focusing on vulnerable customers as they quite often do, but instead the draft rules are just going to embed kind of the consideration of vulnerable customers throughout every part of the customer journey. And firms, the FCA acknowledges that how firms comply with the third requirement around helping customers to pursue their financial objectives will very much depend on the kind of what's within the firm's control and based on their role and knowledge of customers. So it's going to be very different depending on what type of firm you are. And the third kind of last element, so the principles, you've got the principles and then your rules, and they're going to be underpinned by a suite of rules and guidance that set out more detailed expectations for firm and more in relation to conduct. And there will be specific outcomes as part of that. So there's going to be governance of products and services, which involves extending product governance requirements across all of your retail products with different rules for manufacturers and distributors. Price and value is now also going to be considered, and it has to be considered at design and distribution stages, but also on an ongoing basis, and you have to offer fair value for customers. The FCA has included fair price and value as a separate outcome because it wants to stress the importance of price in determining whether a product or service is fit for purpose and offers fair value. Firms are therefore going to need to consider price and value at the product design stage and to defensively determine whether that price that the consumer pays for the product is reasonable in line with the expected benefits of that product. So it's very much you have to be able to justify why you're going out to market with that price and kind of keep reviewing that through the life cycle of the product. Consumer understanding, so it's the next one, and the proposals build and go further than Principle 7 by requiring firms to focus much more on consumer outcomes and again understanding throughout the entire customer journey. Firms are going to need to monitor and, where appropriate, test and adapt communications so that you can demonstrate that you've acted to deliver this outcome and support customers throughout the journey. And finally, customer support. So to enable customers to use products as they anticipated and without facing sort of unreasonable barriers in doing so, the FCA wants firms to provide a level of support that meets customers' needs throughout the relationship with the firm. So, it's not kind of front heavy or end heavy, it's throughout the relationship. And this means that firms' customer service should enable consumers to realise the benefits of the products and services they buy and ensure they're supported when they want to use them and kind of help them pursue their financial objectives. So very much kind of more active requirement there. So some of you may have listened to our winter series. If you missed it, you can get it on our website. But within that, it was the initial consultation on the consumer duty, and I mentioned that there was a potential floodgate for private actions. That is because, in a nutshell, under FISMA, there is a provision which provides that a breach by an authorised person of certain rules made by the FCA are actionable by private persons who suffer loss as a result of that. That section doesn't apply to the current FCA's principles on business, and there was some concern that this new consumer duty would apply, but thankfully I can confirm that the FCA have decided not to attach a private right of action to the consumer duty for the time being anyway, although they have said they're going to keep that under review, but that should hopefully give firms a bit more comfort at the moment, that it's just going to apply as the current principles do. So finally, looking at a couple of practicalities and how the consumer duty is going to work and kind of what's next. So all firms are going to need to adapt and respond to the consumer duty, but the changes that you kind of need to make will depend very much on the nature of your business and your relationships with your customers and kind of the rules that already exist in that sector, depending on the products. Where firms identify that consumers are not receiving good outcomes, the FCA is going to expect you to take appropriate action and rectify that cause. In terms of SMCR, so obviously that at the moment establishes clear senior management responsibilities for compliance with the requirements and standards, but the consumer duty raises this standard by making senior management accountable for the consumer duty, and that's a very clear message in the consultations from the FCA, so something to kind of bear in mind and make sure everyone is aware of that internally. There is going to be a stronger focus on customer interests and outcomes that goes beyond the narrow focus of compliance within the rules going forward. So firms now need to consider the consumer duty at every stage of the process and at every level within your organisational structure. the duty will not apply retrospectively to past business, but will apply on a forward-looking basis. So to existing products, for an example, if you might not be selling them at the moment, but if you've got an existing book, it will apply to those people. The FCA has acknowledged that it's going to be difficult for firms to understand exactly what is expected of them, because this is kind of a whole new kind of area. So hence the kind of second consultation and the need for prescriptive rules, which is something they're obviously working on at the moment and will work on up until July. So you are going to have kind of very kind of fundamental kind of prescriptive rules to abide by. And going forward, the FCA plans to make the consumer duty a sort of an integral part of its whole regulatory approach. And that's from authorisation to firm supervision and enforcement. So it's going to consider it throughout all of its work, rather as kind of like a standalone regime. So it's just something to bear in mind. It's going to have to be at the heart of everything you do if you have retail customers. And that was all I was going to say on the consumer duty, a quick whistle stop tour. And I'll pass you back to Caroline.
Thanks, Tash. That's super interesting, but I'm definitely glad the private right of action seems to have gone for now. So something else that's cropping up in Q3, something I'm super interested in, so I'm quite glad we were seeing some traction in it, and it is the topic of central bank digital currency. So I wanted just to clarify, because sometimes there's a bit of a misunderstanding of the differences between central bank digital currency, generic online banking and cryptocurrencies. So I'm just going to start by going back to basics. So digital currencies are effectively centrally issued form of money, which is legal tender in the country where it's been issued. And we've seen some of these central bank digital currencies already launched, like the Sand Dollar in the Bahamas. Cryptocurrencies are slightly different. They're obviously a store of value which are secured by encryption, and you'll be familiar with types of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. But cryptocurrencies aren't issued by the central bank, and they're not legal tender in the country where they're being distributed. What about online banking then? And how is this different? Well, it's quite simple, really. If you've got your online banking and you've got your ATM card, you can go to an ATM and you can extract the money held within your online banking, and that transforms into cash. Well, central bank digital currency would never be able to transfer into physical pounds and pence. It's just traded and held and stored electronically. Excuse me. So within the UK at the moment, as with probably every other country in the world, and some countries are much more far down the line than us, but currently the Bank of England is considering whether or not the UK should introduce a central bank digital currency. And if it was launched, as I said, it would introduce a new electronic form of central bank money, and that could be used by both individuals and businesses to make and receive payments. But why are the Bank of England doing this? Do we need this? Well, firstly, it's because cryptocurrencies are grown in popularity as a means of trading value, but they're not regulated and they're quite volatile and they're potentially unsafe. A central bank digital currency would provide a safer and more trustworthy payment service. But before this is done, before it's issued, the government and businesses really must work through a number of operational issues. For example, how do you differentiate digital currencies to standard currency within your accounting systems? That's one, but there's huge legal, regulatory, and kind of just day-to-day implications that needs to be worked through. So against that backdrop, in November last year, the Bank of England did announce that it would work to launch a joint consultation with HM Treasury in Q3 2022. And that would be looking at the merits of continuing with the CBDC journey. And it's aiming to look at kind of how an operational and technology model might look for CBDCs in the UK, and what would be the potential benefits, what are the implications, and that's both for users and businesses. So if the outcome of the consultation is positive, then we could be seeing the introduction of central bank digital currencies in the UK, but it won't be a quick fix. It won't come anytime soon. I would imagine it would be the latter part of the decade before we see it. So not too far away, but there's plenty of time to kind of get the arrangements in place to make it launch safely. So Q3 done for now. On to Q4. As you can see, the further we get through the year, the less and less there is that we know is going to fall in that period to date. So not many early Christmas presents for 22 here, but Tash is going to talk about the changes that we're expecting in relation to financial promotions, because that's quite an interesting topic as well. So over to you, Tash.
Thanks, Caroline. Yes, I'm just going to touch upon this one very briefly because I know it won't apply to everyone on the call today. And also, we don't actually know a huge amount of detail on it yet. But under the UK's financial promotion regime, which is set out in section 21 of FSMA for those that are interested. At the moment, any authorised firm can approve an unauthorised person's financial promotion without kind of having to pass any specific test or suitability of competence before it does that. Quite often we see companies that aren't authorised relying on their financial advisor or broker, which are generally both authorised to approve financial promotions. And this is a service that some of you listening today might provide. Examples can include when companies are inviting individuals to invest, there may be a financial promotion element there which your accountant or financial advisor signs off for you. So this was an area of kind of concern for the FCA, and in order to strengthen the FCA's ability to ensure that the approval of financial promotions kind of operate effectively, HMT consulted in 2020 on proposals to establish a regulatory gateway, which a firm is going to have to pass through before it's able to approve a financial promotion of an unauthorised firm. And any firm wishing to approve the financial promotions of unauthorised firms are in the proposals, they kind of said that they would have to obtain consent of the FCA to do that. So following on from the consultation, HM Treasury confirmed that there will be a restriction brought, and that's going to be done through FCA requirements rather than legislation. And it's likely that the FCA are going to consult further on this in October this year. So if this does apply to you, it's definitely one to keep on the radar. Through the consultation, we know that when the gateway is in place, there's going to be a prohibition in the form of kind of an imposition of a financial promotion requirement on a firm's permissions. And this is going to prevent all new and existing authorised firms from approving a financial promotion of an authorised person. So there's just a blanket, you can't do it, unless where you want to do that, you have to apply to the FCA to do so, and that's using a variation of requirement application, and that would remove the prohibition in either whole or part, depending on kind of what the FCA, how they assess you and whether they think that you are able to do so. It's worth calling out, however, that the new gateway won't apply to a firm approving financial promotions of an authorised person within the same group, or the approval of an authorised firm's own promotion, which is then going to be communicated by an unauthorised person. Approving financial promotions for an appointed representative in relation to regulated activities for which the principal has agreed to accept responsibility will also be exempt. So there are some exemptions there which might apply to quite a few of you. The government have said there's going to be a transitional period, so it's not just going to come into play. It's a 3-step transitional period to allow a orderly transition between these new regimes. So that's all I have to say on that, because there isn't a huge amount of detail yet, but definitely keep it on your radar and diarise for October if this is going to impact you.
Thanks, Tash. Thank you. So we've either perfectly timed it, or we've done it slightly over, because there's going to be no time for questions, unfortunately, today. But there is time just to give you a couple of hints, just to tell you where you can find some more information. It's quite good to have keep an eye on the regulatory initiatives grid, which was published by the FCA later last year. We always subscribe to the FCA's news and publication email alerts, and that means you get the information as soon as it's hot off the press. Keep an eye on legislation trackers and case law, but also keep an eye on Burness Paul Insights and Events page, or just get in touch with us. And that's the same if you do have any questions from anything that we've discussed today, please do not hesitate to drop us an email or give us a phone, add us on LinkedIn, just pick our brains. We're very happy to engage and just help you out as much as we can. So without further ado, I just want to thank you all for taking an hour out of your morning. Hopefully you've learned something, and hopefully we haven't scared you too much with some of the initiatives this year. Also want to thank Natasha, Lorna and Chris for speaking today, and also for everyone behind the scenes at Burness Paul who's helped pull this together. We keep an eye out. We'll be putting on more events throughout the year, so do keep an eye. If you've not subscribed to our mailing list, do so, and if there's anything we can help you with, please do get in touch. Have a lovely day, and we will look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.